A single act of kindness can ripple through a life in ways you never imagined. Taryn Blake's world shifts when a quiet man enters her diner each morning. But what happens when he suddenly disappears? As she unravels the mystery of his absence, she uncovers secrets that will challenge everything she believes about loyalty loss and the true value of kindness. Want to find out how it all unfolds? Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What moment had the most impact? And where are you watching from? It was still early when the gray clouds rolled low over Clearwater, that quiet little town where nothing much ever changed, and everyone's life seemed to move in slow motion. The smell of fried bacon, burnt toast, and black coffee clung to the air inside Miller's Diner, the kind of place where truckers, factory workers, and retirees traded small talk to fill the silence. Behind the counter moved Taryn Blake, a young black waitress with steady hands, quick reflexes, and eyes that had seen more struggle than most her age. Her uniform was clean, but faded at the seams, and the soles of her shoes had gone soft from too many double shifts. She worked because she had to rent medicine for her mother, and a quiet promise she'd made to herself to never give up no matter how tight things got. The bell above the door rang at exactly 8:10, slicing through the diner's hum. A tall, elderly black man stepped in, water dripping from his gray overcoat, a brown hat shading half his face. He paused for a moment as if scanning for ghosts, then chose the booth by the window, the one that caught the morning light even on cloudy days. He didn't look around or call for service. He just sat folding his trembling hands around a cup that wasn't there yet, waiting in silence. Taryn noticed him right away. He wasn't like the others. Something about the careful way he carried himself, the tired nobility in his posture, spoke of a man who'd once stood proud, but had long since put his armor down. She approached with her notepad, her tone respectful, but warm. "Morning, sir. What can I get you?" His voice was gravel and memory. Black coffee, 2 slices of toast, scrambled eggs. Nothing fancy. Taryn nodded. "Coming right up." As she moved back to the counter, she could still feel his eyes on her, not in the way men sometimes looked at her, but as if he were studying a face he'd once known in another lifetime. When she returned with his order, steam curling from the plate, he gave a small, deliberate nod of thanks, but said nothing more. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small brass pocket watch, its cover etched with intricate swirls. Clicking it open, he studied the time, 8:15 exactly, then set it beside his plate before taking the first sip of coffee. That tiny gesture, repeated with ritual precision, stayed with Taryn long after she turned away. She couldn't help glancing back between orders, drawn to the quiet presence of the old man who seemed half there, half somewhere else entirely. He ate slowly, staring through the window at the rain that traced crooked lines down the glass. At one point, a family of 3 entered, laughing, loud alive, and he watched them for a few seconds longer, then seemed casual. When the little girl pressed her face to the window and smiled, he smiled faintly back, though it faded before it fully formed. Taryn had seen loneliness before. It wore different faces, but always carried the same weight, the same silent ache that didn't need words to explain. She didn't know what his story was, but she felt it, the heaviness behind his stillness. When he was done, he reached for his wallet, but didn't count his change. He placed the bills carefully on the table, and then beside them set down a single silver kin, polished, smooth engraved with the year 1964. Taryn reached for it, assuming it was a mistake, but by the time she looked up, he was already on his feet. "Sir, you forgot your—" She started, but he gave a small shake of his head. "No mistake," he murmured, tucking his pocket watch away before walking out into the drizzle. The bell over the door gave a lonely ring as he disappeared into the gray. Later during her break, Taryn turned the coin over in her palm. 1964. She wasn't even born then. It felt deliberate, though, like a token or a clue. She slipped it into her apron pocket, the metal cool against her skin. For the rest of the morning, every time the door opened, her eyes went to the window booth, half expecting him to return. He didn't. But something had shifted in her. She couldn't explain why, but she felt lighter the way one does after doing something kind, or witnessing something quietly meaningful. As she cleaned his table that afternoon, she found his coffee cup still warm, untouched toast on the plate, and a faint ring where the pocket watch had sat. For some reason, she ran her fingers over that mark before wiping it clean. When the lunch rush came, she went back to the rhythm of orders and plates, but part of her stayed in that moment with the man in the gray coat who had spoken so little, yet somehow said so much. That night in her small apartment, Taryn emptied her apron. The silver coin rolled across the table, catching the light from her lamp. She picked it up again and smiled faintly. There was something about the year 1964 that she couldn't shake. It was the year of the Civil Rights Act, the year people like her had begun to be seen to be counted. She wondered if that was why he'd left it. A message. The next morning, rain still whispered against the windows of Miller's Diner, the smell of coffee and damp earth clinging to the air like memory. At exactly 8:10, the bell above the door chimed again, and there he was, the same gray coat, the same brown hat, the same steady walk that seemed too measured to be casual. Mr. Lowell Gaines slid into the same booth by the window, like a ritual already set in stone. Taryn Blake noticed him before anyone else did. She was refilling a cup of black coffee for a trucker at the counter when her eyes caught the faint reflection of the man in the rain-streaked glass. For reasons she couldn't explain, a small smile tugged at her lips. She poured fresh coffee into a clean mug, placed 2 slices of toast on a plate, and cracked 3 eggs into a pan without even needing to ask. By the time she reached his table, he was already placing his brass pocket watch beside his napkin just as before. "Morning, sir," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Good morning," he replied quietly, eyes still on the rain outside. His tone was polite, almost formal, as if conversation were a lost language he was relearning. When she placed his plate down, he gave a faint nod but said nothing more. Taryn lingered for a moment before walking away, but when she looked back, she caught him smiling faintly, a subtle shift, like sunlight breaking through fog. Throughout the week, the routine continued. Every morning at 8:10, Mr. Gaines appeared. Every morning, Taryn served him without needing to ask. He always ate slowly, drank 2 cups of coffee, checked his pocket watch twice, and left a neatly folded tip beside that same silver coin from the first day. It had become their quiet understanding, a kind of unspoken conversation made from gestures instead of words. The regulars started noticing too. "That old fella your uncle or something the cook Manny teased one morning while flipping pancakes?" "No," Taryn said, "simply just someone who likes breakfast the same way I do quiet." Still, she found herself glancing at the door whenever the clock neared 8:10. She told herself it was just habit, but deep down she knew it was more than that. There was something grounding about him, something that steadied the chaos of her own life. On the 6th morning, when she set his plate down, Mr. Gaines finally looked up from his cup and asked, "Do you believe people still mean well?" The question caught her mid-motion, her hand still holding the coffee pot. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "Sorry," she asked. "I said, do you believe people still mean well?" He repeated his voice. Calm, not challenging, more like he was testing the temperature of her heart. Taryn thought for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think most people want to do right, even if they forget how sometimes." He studied her face, as though committing her words to memory, then reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small leather notebook, and wrote something down. "That's rare these days," he murmured, closing it again. She smiled, unsure what to say, and for a while neither of them spoke. But something had shifted between them. From that morning on, there was a new rhythm, still quiet, still polite, but heavier with meaning. Occasionally he'd ask small things, how her mother was doing, how late she worked, whether she ever got time for herself. His voice carried the softness of a man who'd spent years alone. When she asked about his family, he'd only say, "They're busy people," then change the subject. Once he asked what she wanted most in life. She told him honestly, peace. Just a little peace. He nodded, as if that answer made more sense than anything else in the world. That day when he paid his bill, she found another note tucked beneath the coin. In shaky handwriting, it read, "You bring calm to noisy places." She kept that note in her apron pocket the rest of the day, touching it each time exhaustion threatened to pull her under. Over time, other customers began noticing the quiet bond forming between them, the waitress and the old man in gray. Some joked about it. Some whispered, but Taryn didn't care. In a life full of shifts that blurred into one another, he was the one thing that felt steady. Every time she poured his coffee, she felt like the world slowed just enough to breathe. One morning she arrived at the diner early and saw him outside through the fogged glass, standing beneath the awning, sheltering from the drizzle. For a brief moment he seemed younger, more alive, straight-backed coat, buttoned, the kind of presence that commanded respect, even in silence. She opened the door for him, and he nodded. "You're early," she said. "Time moves faster when you've got someone waiting on the other end," he replied. It was the first thing he'd said that made her chest tighten. She didn't know it yet, but he wasn't talking about breakfast. He was talking about something deeper, something she would only understand much later. That afternoon, when he finished his meal and stood to leave, he reached into his pocket again. By the third week, Miller's Diner had settled into its rhythm again, coffee brewing, silverware clinking, and the same hum of small-town monotony that filled the mornings. But for Taryn Blake, something inside that rhythm had changed. The familiar routine no longer felt lifeless. It had purpose now. Every day at 8:10, Mr. Lowell Gaines entered with quiet dignity, always greeting her with the same soft nod that somehow meant more than 1,000 words. Their ritual had deepened into something gentle and unspoken, a conversation without sound, carried by gestures, small acts, and the exchange of trust between two people who both carried the weight of solitude. When she poured his coffee, she no longer asked how he liked it. She already knew. When she refilled his cup, he'd always wait until she stepped back before lifting it, like it was part of a dance that didn't need music. He never forgot to check his brass pocket watch, always at the same time, and she never forgot to notice. That small motion had become her clock too. But outside the diner, Taryn's world was still grinding her down. Her mother's medical bills had doubled, the landlord had left another warning under her door, and the exhaustion was beginning to seep into her bones. She worked double shifts, skipped meals, and studied late into the night for a certification she wasn't sure she'd ever finish. Yet each morning when Mr. Gaines appeared, she found herself standing taller. The old man had become something of a reminder that goodness still existed in a world that had often forgotten her. On a gray Tuesday morning, as she walked toward the diner, her shoes gave out completely, the sole peeling away like tired skin. She sighed and pushed through the door anyway, ready to hide her embarrassment behind a practiced smile. The regulars barely noticed, but when she reached Mr. Gaines's booth, he looked down at her feet before saying a word. He didn't comment, didn't ask, just studied the fraying edges of her shoes for a moment, then lifted his eyes to meet hers. There was something in that look, understanding recognition. Quiet resolve. "Hard morning?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Just another one." He nodded. Some mornings weigh more than others, that was all. He didn't pry and she didn't explain. But when her shift ended that day, she stepped outside to find a small cardboard box leaning against the diner's door. Inside was a pair of black leather work shoes, simple, sturdy, new. No card, no name, no explanation. Taryn's throat tightened. She looked around, scanning the empty parking lot, the slow-moving clouds, the single crow perched on the street lamp. But there was no sign of him. She knew it had to be him. No one else would have noticed, let alone cared. The next morning she wore the shoes to work. The fit was perfect. But when 8:10 arrived, the bell over the diner door stayed silent. She wiped down his booth twice, pretending it was just another day. But the truth pressed heavy against her chest. Something felt wrong. By 9:00, her smile had faded. By noon, she'd given up pretending. She went about her shift on autopilot, her eyes flicking to the window every time headlights passed outside. But he didn't come. When she finally got a break, she sat in his booth for the first time, just to feel what he might have seen: the street, the slow drizzle, the steam on the glass. That's when she saw it. A folded napkin tucked neatly under the sugar jar, edges damp from condensation. She reached for it, her hands trembling slightly, and unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, shaky, deliberate, each letter written with care. It read, "For walking farther than most ever try." The diner around her blurred for a second, sound thinning into the distance. She folded the napkin again and pressed it against her chest, blinking away the sting in her eyes. Manny, the cook, noticed the silence. "You okay, kid?" he asked from behind the counter. She nodded, her voice steady. "Yeah, just thinking." She didn't tell him about the note, the shoes, or the way her heart had begun to ache with worry. That night after her shift, she walked home in the rain wearing those new shoes. The soles gripped the wet pavement firmly, and for once she didn't slip. She thought about him, the way he looked out the window, the calm patience in his voice, the way he asked questions like they were tiny keys to something larger. She had met plenty of customers before, but no one had ever felt like this, like a chapter in a story she hadn't realized she was living. When she reached her apartment, she took the napkin from her apron pocket, smoothed it flat, and pinned it to the wall beside her bed, right next to the silver coin and the note he'd once written, "You bring calm to noisy places." Together, they looked like fragments of a conversation between two souls who had chosen kindness over indifference. The next morning, she arrived at the diner early, hoping, almost praying, that he would come back. 8:10 came and went. The door stayed closed. 8:39:00, still nothing. Every time someone new entered, her heart lifted for half a second before falling again. By noon, she had memorized the sound of disappointment in the bell's silence. But as she wiped the counter, she noticed something else on his table. A coffee stain in the perfect shape of a ring, right where his cup would have been. She stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "You'll be back," as though saying it out loud might make it true. That night, her mother called from the hospital, coughing between words, but with warmth in her tone. "I can hear it in your voice, baby," she said. "You sound different lately." "Do I?" Taryn asked, forcing a laugh. "Yeah," her mother said softly. The rain didn't stop for 3 days, and neither did Taryn's waiting. Every morning she arrived early, made sure the coffee pot was full, and kept the corner booth spotless, just in case Mr. Gaines walked in. But each time the doorbell chimed, it was never him. By the second day, even the regulars noticed her glances towards the window. Expecting someone, Manny asked while stacking plates. "Just keeping busy," she replied, but her tone betrayed her. The absence felt heavier than she'd imagined it could. It wasn't just that the booth was empty, it was that the rhythm of the diner felt off, like a song missing its most familiar note. Every morning had become a quiet rehearsal of hope and disappointment, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. On the third morning, the clouds broke just enough to let in a muted light. Taryn was wiping down the counter when the mailman came through the door, shaking water from his jacket. "Got something for you, Miss Blake," he said, handing her a plain white envelope. No return address, no stamp, just her initials TB written in tight, careful handwriting. She frowned, turning it over in her hand. "Thanks," she murmured, but her chest was already tightening. She waited until the rush thinned before she opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of napkin, was a single silver coin, gleaming faintly in the morning light, the same one she'd kept from the first day she met Mr. Gaines, engraved with 1964. Her breath caught. How could that be? She still had the original coin tucked safely in her wallet. She pulled it out and compared the two. Identical. Same engraving, same scratch near the edge. For a long time, she just stared at them both, her mind trying to catch up with what her heart already knew he was trying to tell her something. When Manny noticed her frozen in place, he asked if she was okay, but she just slipped both coins into her pocket and forced herself back to work. Yet everything felt different now. The sound of plates, the chatter of customers, even the smell of coffee. It all felt distant, muted, like she was moving underwater. That afternoon, she walked home under a heavy sky, clutching the envelope in her coat pocket. The streets glistened from rain puddles reflecting the diner's neon sign as she passed it. When she reached her small apartment, she set the coins on the table and stared at them. Her mind ran through possibilities. Maybe someone found it and returned it. Maybe it wasn't his at all, but deep down she knew better. Mr. Gaines wasn't careless. Every gesture he'd made had meaning, every silence carried intention. She lay awake that night, the steady rhythm of rain against the window, sounding too much like a clock ticking toward something she couldn't name. Near midnight, she drifted into a restless sleep, only to wake to a faint knocking sound, imagined perhaps, but it sent her heart racing anyway. The next morning, she returned to work with tired eyes and heavy steps. She'd barely tied her apron when two men sitting at the counter started talking loud enough for her to hear. "Heard old man Gaines took a bad fall out on Willow Street," one of them said. "Neighbor found him after 2 days. Poor fellow lives alone. Ain't nobody there to help." The name hit her like a punch. Taryn froze mid-step, her tray trembling in her hands. "You talking about Lowell Gaines?" she asked before she could stop herself. The man nodded. "Yeah, that's him. Used to teach history, I think. Kind old guy. Shame what happened." She forced a small nod, muttered a thank you, and slipped into the back room, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. Willow Street. She remembered it now, the name scribbled on a napkin he'd used once when he'd jotted something about the oak trees near the porch. Her mind replayed the scene again and again, his quiet voice, his slow hands, the way he'd folded that napkin like it carried the world. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and called the local hospital. Her voice shook as she asked for him, and when the nurse confirmed he was there, something between relief and fear broke inside her. She hung up and told Manny she needed her break. "You okay?" he asked, concern wrinkling his forehead. "I just need a few minutes," she said, already reaching for her coat. The hospital was only 6 blocks away, but it felt like miles. The rain had started again, fine and relentless, soaking her shoulders by the time she reached the entrance. Inside, the sterile smell of disinfectant hit her like a wall. She found his name on the patient board, room 212, and walked down the hall with careful steps, her heart pounding. When she reached the door, she paused, gripping the handle, as if steadying herself for something final. But she didn't go in yet. Through the small glass window, she saw him lying there, pale against the sheets, his pocket watch resting on the table beside him. He looked smaller somehow, as if the hospital bed had taken away the quiet strength that used to fill his presence. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The sight of him stirred something deep inside, a mix of sorrow, guilt, and gratitude she couldn't untangle. Finally, she pushed the door open. "Mr. Gaines," she whispered. His eyes fluttered open slowly, confusion giving way to recognition. "Miss Blake." He rasped, his voice soft but steady. "Didn't think anyone would come?" She stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly together. "You didn't show up," she said quietly, trying to smile through the ache in her throat. "So I figured I'd bring breakfast to you instead." His lips curved faintly. "You're too kind," he murmured, his gaze drifting to the coins she held in her palm. "Ah, you got my message." "Both of them," she said, her voice trembling. What does it mean? He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Sometimes people forget that kindness should circle back," he said. "That was just my way of making sure you'd remember." They sat in silence after that, the only sound the slow beep of the monitor beside his bed. She didn't stay long, just long enough to make sure he had someone to talk to, long enough to know he was still there. When she left, she slipped one of the coins back into his hand. "That one's yours," she said. "I'll keep the other." He nodded faintly, his eyes closing as if holding on to her words. The next morning, the air in Clearwater carried a different kind of chill, the kind that seeps through the skin and settles in the bones. Taryn barely slept the night before. Her mind kept replaying the image of Mr. Gaines lying in that hospital bed, the steady beep of the monitor echoing through her thoughts. She arrived at Miller's Diner before sunrise, made a fresh pot of coffee, and stood by the window watching the fog roll over Main Street. For the first time since she'd started working there, she didn't care about tips or orders. All she could think about was whether he had eaten, whether someone had checked on him, whether he still had that quiet strength behind his tired eyes. When Manny arrived and saw her pale face, he didn't ask questions. He just said, "Go see him, kid. I'll cover your shift." The words were simple, but felt like permission she hadn't known she needed. Within minutes, she was out the door with a small brown paper bag filled with a muffin, a thermos of coffee, and a folded napkin that she'd written on "Your booth misses you." The hospital loomed against the gray sky, its concrete walls cold and blank, its windows reflecting nothing but clouds. Inside, the smell of antiseptic made her stomach twist, but she forced herself forward, clutching the bag tightly. She stopped by the nurse's station, her voice hesitant. "Excuse me, I'm here to see Mr. Lowell Gaines, room 212. The nurse, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes of her own, looked up. "Are you family?" she asked. "No," Taryn admitted, "just a friend." The nurse's expression softened. "Then you're the first one." The words hit her harder than expected. "He hasn't had any visitors?" she asked. The nurse shook her head. "None. But yesterday when we told him no one had come, he smiled and said, 'She will. She's always on time.'" Taryn's throat tightened, and she nodded, blinking back the sting in her eyes. "Can I see him? Go ahead," the nurse said gently. "He's been asking for coffee, but not hospital coffee. Said he only drinks it from your diner." The small detail nearly broke her. She walked down the hall, her heart pounding as the floorboards creaked beneath her steps. The door to room 212 was half open, and she hesitated for a moment before pushing it gently. Inside the room was dimly lit, the blinds half drawn. Mr. Gaines lay propped against a thin pillow, his skin pale but his eyes alert. His pocket watch rested on the table beside him, open, as always, ticking steadily like a heartbeat refusing to quit. When he saw her, a faint smile creased his weathered face. "Didn't think anyone would notice if I disappeared," he said, his voice weak, but threaded with dry humor. Taryn placed the bag on the small table and sat in the chair beside his bed. "Of course I noticed," she replied softly. "You missed 3 mornings. The booth started to look wrong without you in it." He chuckled quietly, a sound that seemed to warm the room. "Guess I should have called ahead." She poured him a cup of the coffee she'd brought, the rich aroma immediately filling the air. When she handed it to him, his trembling fingers brushed against hers, and for a second, the room fell into complete stillness. He took a slow sip, closed his eyes, and sighed. "Now that's real coffee," he whispered. "Tastes like morning's worth waking up for." She smiled faintly. "We keep it hot just for you." They talked for a while, not about heavy things, but small ones. The weather, the way the rain seemed to fall, quieter, near the diner. The new waitress who couldn't balance a tray to save her life. It felt strange how natural it was to sit there, as if she wasn't visiting a hospital, but just sharing another quiet breakfast. Yet beneath their conversation was something heavier. Something neither dared to name. "You should be resting," she said after a while, noticing his eyes dimming with fatigue. "I rest too much already," he replied. "The problem with getting old is that the world gets quieter but not kinder. People stop seeing you." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. She reached for his hand instinctively. "I see you," she said. He smiled at that, the kind of smile that carried years of gratitude behind it. "I know," he said softly. "That's why you're here." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of rain on the window mixing with the rhythmic beeping of the machine beside him. Then, almost to himself, he added, "I used to teach kids your age. Told them history was just the story of people trying to matter. Funny thing is, we all stop trying eventually, until someone reminds us we still can." Taryn didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't. Instead, she placed the folded napkin from the bag onto his bedside table. When he read it, "Your booth misses you." He laughed softly, a genuine sound that filled the sterile air with warmth. "You have a good heart," he said. "Don't let the world change that." She stayed longer than she intended. The nurse peeked in, once smiled at the sight of them, and quietly backed away. When it was finally time to go, he reached for her hand again and said, "Don't worry about me, Miss Blake. I've had worse days, but you showing up today, that makes this one a good one." She nodded, unable to speak, then stood and smoothed the blanket near his arm. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said, "and I'll bring pie." "Apple," he said immediately, his tone serious. "You got it," she replied, smiling as she turned to leave. But before she reached the door, he called out one last thing. "Taryn." She paused. It was the first time he'd said her name. "Thank you," he said, "for proving I wasn't invisible." When she stepped into the hall, she found the same nurse waiting nearby. "You're the only one who could get him to eat," the nurse said quietly. "He's refused everyone else. Didn't even want family called, but when he heard your name this morning, he asked if it was time for breakfast yet." Taryn blinked hard, trying not to cry. "I'll come back," she said. "Every day if I have to." The nurse nodded. The following week, the town of Clearwater began to thaw from the long streak of rain. The sky cleared to a faint blue. The streets dried, and the diner's windows once again caught the morning light. For 7 mornings straight, the clock inside Miller's Diner struck 8:10, and with it came the soft chime of the bell above the door. Mr. Gaines had recovered enough to walk again, and though his steps were slower, his smile carried a light Taryn hadn't seen before. When he pushed through the door that first day back, the whole diner seemed to pause. The regulars who'd noticed his absence gave him small nods. Manny shouted from the kitchen, "Look who made it back." The professor, Mr. Gaines, chuckled quietly, adjusting his gray coat before sitting down in his familiar booth by the window. And there was Taryn standing by the counter, her heart lifting in a way she couldn't hide. She brought his coffee before he could even ask, just as always, and set it in front of him with a trembling smile. "You had us worried," she said softly. "I missed my breakfast partner." He raised the cup, his hand shaking slightly, and said, "Can't stay gone too long. Someone's got to keep you honest about your coffee." The lightness in his tone filled the air with something hopeful. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel as it should steady familiar right. They talked a little more than usual this time. He told her about the nurses, how one of them reminded him of his late wife, how the food was terrible, but the mornings were peaceful. "You'd be surprised," he said between sips, "how loud silence can be when you're used to talking to ghosts." Taryn didn't answer. She just reached for the pot and refilled his cup before it went empty. "Then you talk to me instead," she said, half smiling. He smiled too, his eyes glistening, though he looked away before she could see how much her words had meant. For the next several mornings, he came without fail. He'd walk in always at the same time, always with his brass pocket watch tucked in his palm, like a sacred object, always with that same calm presence that steadied the world around him. But something had changed. He ate less, drank slower, and seemed to get tired more quickly. His voice was quieter now, his pauses longer, as though every sentence took thought and care. Taryn noticed, but said nothing. She could sense that he didn't want pity, only normalcy. So she gave him that. On the 5th morning, she found him staring at the silver coin she'd left near the sugar jar weeks ago. He picked it up and turned it in his fingers thoughtfully. "You kept it," he said. "Of course," she replied. "You left it first. Then I guess it belongs to both of us now." He placed it back, carefully, pressing it into place, as if sealing something unspoken between them. Later that morning, when the breakfast rush had passed, the two of them sat quietly for a few minutes, sharing coffee and silence like it was a language only they understood. He glanced out the window and said, "You ever think about what you'll do when all this changes, when mornings stop being mornings?" She frowned. "I don't follow. One day he said people like me stop showing up. That's life's way of reminding people like you to keep going anyway." She stared at him, her chest tightening, because somehow it felt like a goodbye disguised as advice. "You're not going anywhere," she said lightly. "You've got pie coming tomorrow." He smiled faintly, but didn't answer. The next morning he came again, though slower than ever. His coat seemed heavier on his shoulders, his breathing more labored. When Taryn brought his breakfast, he looked at her for a long time before speaking. "You know, Miss Blake, I used to think kindness was a currency that ran out, but you've proved me wrong." She blinked, unsure how to respond. "You gave me something I hadn't felt in years." He continued, his tone fragile but steady. "You reminded me what it's like to be seen, not pitied. That's rarer than gold these days." She swallowed hard. "You've done the same for me," she said softly. "You've made me believe people can still mean well." He smiled at that, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small sealed envelope. "Then keep this," he said, sliding it across the table toward her. "Open it when the booth feels too empty." "You don't have to give me anything," she said, trying to push it back, but he shook his head. "This isn't about giving," he said. "It's about remembering." Something in his tone made her stop insisting. She took the envelope and slipped it into her apron pocket, promising silently she'd wait until the right time. When he stood to leave, she noticed the tremor in his hand as he reached for his hat. "You take care of yourself," she said. "I'll see you tomorrow." He looked at her, then eyes, soft smile barely there. "Tomorrow?" he echoed. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped out, and for the first time she didn't watch him go. She just smiled, wiped down his booth, and thought about how strange it was that something so ordinary, a breakfast, a cup of coffee, a few quiet words, could become the most extraordinary part of her day. But the next morning when the clock struck 8:10, the door didn't open. At first she thought maybe he'd overslept. Then 8:20 passed, then 9:00. The hours stretched thin, and her heart sank deeper with each one. The booth by the window remained empty, his pocket watch-shaped ring still faintly visible on the table where he used to set it. She told herself he'd be back the next day. But the next day came, and he wasn't. Then the next. By the fourth morning, she took the envelope from her drawer, running her fingers over the sealed flap. Her hands trembled, but she didn't open it. Not yet. Something inside her wasn't ready to know what goodbye might sound like in his handwriting. That evening after closing, she sat alone in the diner lights, dim, the rain beginning again outside. She poured herself a cup of black coffee and placed another across from her, still steaming, just in case she whispered, glancing toward the door. The morning came quietly, the kind of morning that carried the weight of something missing. Miller's diner smelled of fresh biscuits and burnt toast, but to Taryn it felt hollow. The booth by the window remained empty for the 7th straight day, the shape of his absence carved into the space like a shadow that refused to fade. She still poured 2 cups of coffee every morning, one for herself and one for him, and placed his on the table out of habit. The other waitresses had stopped asking questions, though Manny sometimes looked her way with the kind of sympathy that made her chest tighten. She hadn't opened the envelope yet. It sat tucked inside her apron every shift, softening at the edges, the paper faintly smelling of the same cologne Mr. Gaines used to wear. Every time she thought about it, her hand would drift toward the pocket, but something always stopped her, some stubborn, quiet hope that maybe he'd walk through the door before she ever had to read his final words. That morning around 8:10, the diner door finally opened, and for a heartbeat, her world lit up. She looked up fast, smile already forming, but froze halfway. It wasn't him. 4 tall men in black suits entered instead, their polished shoes clicking sharply against the tile. Their presence didn't fit the diner's rhythm. The regulars fell silent, forks pausing mid-air, the only sound the faint hum of the griddle behind the counter. The men carried themselves like they were used to being watched, but not questioned. Behind them walked 2 other men, both dressed in dark overcoats, one carrying a folder, the other a small wooden box. Taryn's stomach tightened as the group stopped near her counter. The taller of the 2 men removed his hat and asked in a low, calm voice, "Are you Miss Blake?" The diner went dead quiet. Taryn blinked, her voice catching. "Yes," she said slowly. "Is something wrong?" The man exchanged a glance with the lawyer beside him. Then he placed the wooden box on the counter between them. "We represent Mr. Lowell Gaines," he said. "He passed away last week." The words hit like a blow she wasn't ready for. The clatter of dishes, the low murmur of customers, even the steady drip from the coffee pot, all of it faded into silence. "No," she whispered, her breath trembling. "That can't be right. He was just here." Her words faltered as reality caught up. The empty booth, the sealed envelope, the way he'd said tomorrow without meeting her eyes. The lawyer continued gently. He left specific instructions. "We were to find you, Miss Blake, and deliver this personally." The wooden box sat between them, polished small enough to hold, with 2 hands heavy with meaning. The man stepped back as the lawyer opened his folder and pulled out a document. Mr. Gaines left a few personal effects, some instructions, and a letter addressed only to you. He spoke of you with great respect. The second lawyer nodded. He made it clear that this was not charity. His exact words were she's family in all the ways that matter. The sound of that sentence broke what composure she had left. She covered her mouth, trying not to cry, but the tears came anyway, slow and quiet. Manny stepped forward from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, but stopped when he saw the look on her face. "It's okay, Taryn," he said softly. "Take your time." She nodded faintly, not trusting her voice. The taller man cleared his throat. "There's more," he said, placing a second envelope beside the box. "We're to stay while you open this one. It confirms that you've received what he intended." Her hands trembled as she took the envelope. The seal was pressed with wax, the initials LG faintly embossed. For a moment she just stared at it, unwilling to break the last tangible thing that connected her to him. When she finally did, the paper tore with a soft sigh, and a folded letter slipped out. She unfolded it slowly, her breath catching as she recognized his handwriting, uneven but deliberate, the same she'd seen on napkins and notes. Miss Blake, it began. "If you're reading this, then my time has already turned its last page. I'd hoped for one more morning, but life has a habit of closing the book mid-sentence. You once told me you believed people still meant well. I needed to hear that more than you could imagine. For years, I'd stopped believing in anything kind. You reminded me that goodness can still exist in quiet corners and small gestures in a diner booth and a cup of coffee poured by someone who cares." She wiped at her eyes, reading on "The box you've been given contained something that kept me grounded when I didn't have much else. It's not worth money, but it's worth memory. Keep it safe. Inside, you'll find the only things I couldn't bring myself to part with my watch, a photograph, and one more letter meant only for you." Her vision blurred as she reached for the box, her fingers tracing the wood grain. The taller man nodded for her to open it. She hesitated, then lifted the lid slowly. Inside lay the familiar brass pocket watch, still ticking faintly, as if time itself had refused to accept he was gone. Beside it was a folded photograph, an image of the two of them taken by some customer she hadn't even noticed one morning when they'd shared a laugh over spilled coffee. He must have asked for a copy. It was framed neatly in his desk at home. She remembered seeing the frame during her hospital visit without realizing what it held. At the bottom of the box was a smaller sealed envelope, labeled simply, "For when you're ready." She didn't open it. Not yet. The lawyer closed his folder quietly. "There's one last thing," he said. "He wanted you to know that this wasn't goodbye. He said you'd understand what that meant when the time came." Then with a nod, the men stepped back and left her there, surrounded by the stillness that followed. For a long while, Taryn stood motionless, the box open before her, her reflection trembling in the polished surface of the counter. Around her life slowly resumed cups, clinking plates, sliding a bell ringing somewhere. But none of it felt real. She looked at the watch, its ticking soft but steady, and whispered, "You kept your promise." That night the wooden box sat on Taryn's kitchen table under the dim yellow light of her apartment, its brass hinges gleaming faintly in the stillness. The world outside her window was dark. The rain steady, but her mind replayed the morning again and again, the black suits, the lawyer's calm voices, the words she wished she hadn't heard. She hadn't eaten, hadn't even taken off her apron. The smell of coffee had faded, replaced by that strange metallic scent that lingered in moments of silence too deep to be ordinary. She stared at the box as if it might breathe. Her fingers traced the outline of the brass pocket watch, its rhythmic ticking too steady to be from a dead man. It wasn't just keeping time, it was keeping him. Next to it lay the photograph of them both, the same one she'd once seen in his home, though she hadn't known it then. In the picture, she was mid-laugh, caught off guard, a streak of sunlight falling across her face, while Mr. Gaines smiled faintly beside her. He looked content, something she hadn't noticed in life, but now could see written all over his expression. Beside the photo lay the smaller envelope marked, "For when you're ready." She'd told herself she wouldn't open it tonight, but she knew she would. She reached for it slowly, her hands trembling as she broke the seal. Inside was a letter written in the same slanted script that had once filled napkins and notes. The first words were simple, but stopped her cold. "You gave me what my own children could not, time, laughter, and warmth." She exhaled shakily and continued reading. "I lived most of my years waiting for noise to mean something. Crowded rooms, polite smiles, empty words, but I never found peace in any of it. Peace came in small doses, in moments I'd forgotten how to notice, until one morning a tired waitress poured my coffee before I could ask. And I realized the world hadn't run out of kindness yet. You may not think much of it, but what you gave me was not service. It was company. You reminded me what it felt like to be seen without expectation." The words blurred as tears welled up, but she wiped them quickly, determined to finish. "My family drifted long before I grew old. I taught them how to think, but I never taught them how to care. They measure worth in what's left behind. You measured it in how much you gave. I wanted you to know that the mornings we shared, the silence, the rain, the small talk, were the best part of my final years. You think I was helping you, but you were the one saving me." Taryn pressed her palm to her mouth, fighting the sob that rose in her throat. She read on. "I left you the watch because I want you to have my mornings. It ticks for you now. When you hear it, remember that someone believed in your goodness without needing proof. The house I left you isn't much, but it's yours. It has one room that gets light at sunrise. Sit there sometimes. Drink your coffee slow. That's where peace lives." She paused, her breath trembling as the tears began to fall freely. The letter's tone softened further, the last words written smaller, as though his hand had weakened near the end. "Thank you, Taryn. You taught an old man that kindness doesn't fade with age. The world will forget me soon, but it won't forget the goodness you carry. Promise me this. Keep serving, keep smiling, keep believing people mean well. That's how healing begins." At the bottom of the envelope, folded beneath the letter, was something else, a thin, well-worn notebook. Its leather cover was cracked at the corners, and across the front, in faded ink, was written, "The Morning Ledger." She opened it carefully, the scent of old paper rising as she turned the first page. The handwriting inside was familiar, though uneven, as if written with shaking hands. Each page was dated, each one chronicling their mornings at the diner. Day 1. She smiled before I spoke. Day 2. She remembered my order without asking. Day 5. She refilled my cup and didn't rush away. Day 8. She asked if I was lonely. I lied. The entries continued, simple but achingly personal, a diary of kindness. Some days had only a single line, others full paragraphs. Day 47. She looked tired today, but still smiled. I left an extra coin so she'd know someone noticed. On one page, he'd even drawn the outline of the diner window and written, "She always looks at the rain like it's telling her secrets." Taryn's hands trembled as she reached the final page. The ink there was darker, fresher, as if written only days before he'd passed. Day 172. She smiled before I spoke. That's how healing begins. She closed the notebook, slowly pressing it to her chest, as tears ran down her face unchecked. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, tapping lightly against the glass. The ticking of the watch seemed louder now, filling the apartment with its steady heartbeat. For a long time, she sat there in silence, the letter open beside her, the photograph propped against the box. Her grief came not as a storm, but as a quiet wave washing through her until only calm remained. When she finally rose, she went to the window and looked out at the street below, empty, glistening, alive with reflections of passing lights. She could almost see him there, walking slowly with his hat tipped low, carrying the same quiet dignity he'd always worn. She whispered, "You kept your promise, Mr. Gaines," her voice breaking but sure. Then she turned back to the table and picked up the brass pocket watch. The hands ticked forward, unwavering, as though they too refused to stop moving. She held it to her ear, the rhythm steady and alive, and for a brief second it sounded like his voice. The letter, the watch, the photograph, the notebook, they were more than keepsakes. They were proof that small kindness could outlive the people who gave it. She took one deep breath, folded the letter carefully, and placed it back inside the envelope. The box would stay on the table tonight, she decided, open and breathing, because closing it felt like ending something that wasn't meant to end. When she finally went to bed, she left the watch ticking softly on her nightstand beside the silver coin. The next morning came gray and still, with a thin fog blanketing Clearwater like a memory that refused to fade. The wooden box still sat on Taryn's table from the night before, the pocket watch ticking softly beside it, as if marking the silence between one life and another. She had not slept. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard his voice, gentle and certain, telling her that kindness was the only thing worth passing on. The rain had finally stopped, but the world outside her window still felt soaked in his absence. When the knock came at her door around 9, it startled her. She opened it to find one of the lawyers from the diner, Mr. Langford, holding a brown envelope and looking slightly uncomfortable in his pressed suit. "Miss Blake," he greeted softly. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early, but there's more we need to discuss. May I come in?" She nodded and stepped aside. He placed the envelope on the table directly beside the wooden box. "I didn't want to overwhelm you yesterday," he said, "but Mr. Gaines made some arrangements before his passing. He asked that they be explained to you personally after you'd read his letter." Her stomach tightened. "What kind of arrangements?" she asked. He opened the envelope and pulled out several official documents, unfolding them carefully on the table. "Mr. Gaines left everything he owned to you, Miss Blake," he said. "The house on Willow Street, the small savings account he had, and a few personal belongings that hold sentimental value. There's also a trust fund, one he created only a few months ago." She blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. Everything. Everything, he confirmed. His instructions were explicit. He said you were the only person who had treated him like family. Taryn sank slowly into the nearest chair, her hands trembling against her knees. I can't take that," she said, shaking her head. "I didn't do anything to deserve it." The lawyer's expression softened. "I've read a lot of wills, Miss Blake. Some are written in anger, some in guilt, some in loneliness. His wasn't any of those. It was gratitude, pure and simple. He said you gave him his last good mornings, and he wanted to give you something that could buy you a few peaceful ones of your own." She stared at the documents in disbelief, the words blurring together. There it was, her name, written neatly beside his signature. The property deed to his home, the balance of his savings account modest but significant. A line marked, "The Mourning Fund," holding just enough to erase her mother's medical debts entirely. He did this. She whispered, her voice barely audible. "He did," Langford said. "And there's one more thing." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded sheet of parchment, older, yellowed at the edges. "This was tucked into the deed. He wanted you to see it after you knew." She took it carefully, unfolding it with shaking fingers. Across the top, in his unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For the one who still believes people mean well." Her breath caught as she traced the letters with her fingertip. Underneath, written in the same faint ink, was a short note. "Keep believing that, Taryn. It will save more people than money ever could." The lawyer waited quietly as she wiped at her eyes. "He thought you'd protest," he said gently. So he added this clause. He tapped one of the papers. "If you refuse the inheritance, it goes to a community fund he established years ago for students from Clearwater High. He said you'd accept it only if it still helped others. So either way, he made sure you'd have peace with it." She gave a small, tearful laugh. "That sounds like him." Langford smiled faintly. "Yes, it does." He gathered the remaining papers and slid them neatly into a folder. "You don't need to decide anything today," he said. "The house is ready whenever you want to visit. He had it cleaned a week before he passed, said he wanted it to feel warm for you." He knew she asked softly. He knew the lawyer said simply. After he left, the apartment fell silent again, but it didn't feel as empty this time. The envelope, the box, the letter, all of it now felt like pieces of a map, leading her toward something larger than grief. By late afternoon, she found herself walking toward Willow Street, her steps slow but steady. The air was crisp, and the trees along the road swayed gently, their branches whispering above her. When she reached his house, she paused at the gate, staring at the modest brick structure she'd only seen once before, through the hospital window of his stories. The curtains were drawn back, and through the glass, she saw a faint glint of sunlight catching the rim of a photo frame inside. The front door opened easily. The scent of old books, cedar, and faint cologne greeted her like a familiar voice. The house was quiet, but not lifeless. It was filled with the warmth of someone who had loved his solitude deeply, but not bitterly. On the small table by the door sat another note, written on plain stationery. "Welcome home, Miss Blake. The kettle's by the stove." She laughed through her tears, setting her purse down before wandering through the rooms. Everything was exactly as he'd described: the worn chair by the window, the shelf filled with history books, the framed certificates from his teaching years, the photographs of places she'd never been, but he'd once promised to tell her about. In the corner of the living room, a faded armchair faced the same direction his booth window had faced in the diner east, toward the morning light. She ran her hand over its armrest and whispered, "You brought the morning with you." On the mantel above the old fireplace, she found the deed again framed in glass. Beneath his signature, written in faint pencil, was a message she hadn't noticed before: "For walking farther than most ever try." She smiled, remembering the napkin that had carried the same words. It felt as though every gesture he'd made had come full circle, returning to her exactly as he'd meant it to. She spent hours wandering through the house, discovering fragments of his life, handwritten notes, underlined passages in books, even an old newspaper clipping about his years as a teacher. In one drawer, she found a photograph of a much younger Mr. Gaines, with a group of students, his expression proud and alive. The caption read, "Mr. Gaines inspires students to believe in kindness." She touched the photo and whispered, "You never stopped." As evening settled, she made tea in his kitchen and sat by the window where the last light of day spilled across the floor. She set the pocket watch beside her cup, its steady ticking blending with the creak of the old house. Everything he had given her, his time, his trust, his home, was proof that kindness could outlast even death. That night, Taryn didn't go home. She stayed in Mr. Gaines's house on Willow Street, the one that had somehow already begun to feel like hers. The walls breathed with stories, the air holding a warmth that didn't belong to the fireplace, but to the man who had once filled these rooms with quiet decency. Outside, the street lamps cast long shadows across the porch, and somewhere a train horn echoed faintly, the kind of sound that traveled through time more than space. She brewed herself a cup of tea, using his kettle, careful not to disturb the neatness of the kitchen. Every corner seemed to hold a trace of him. The books aligned perfectly on their shelves, the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering near the old armchair, the watch ticking steadily in her pocket, as if reminding her that time hadn't stopped, only softened. She sat by the front window and stared out at the sleepy town. Clearwater looked the same, but to her, everything had shifted. The diner lights flickered down the street, small and steadfast, like the kind of place where life's simplest truths had the courage to exist. She thought about the first morning they met the gray coat, the silver coin, the way he'd checked his pocket watch, like he was making sure the world still ran on time. And she thought about every morning since, the small rituals, the quiet exchanges, the laughter that didn't need words. It was strange she realized how kindness could weave itself through ordinary days until it became extraordinary without anyone noticing. She set the cup down and walked to the fireplace. The mantel was lined with framed photographs, students in classrooms, smiling faces from long ago, a woman she assumed was his late wife, and one new photo she hadn't noticed before. It was the picture of them together in the diner, the one from the wooden box. Beneath it, carved into a thin brass plate, were the words, "Morning worth remembering." Her throat tightened as she touched the frame, her fingertips brushing against the glass. Behind it, tucked into the edge of the mantel, she found another small notebook, one she hadn't seen before. Its cover was plain, the pages slightly curled at the corners. When she opened it, she saw his handwriting again, shaky, but legible. It wasn't a ledger of days. This time it was something more personal. The first page read simply, "Notes for my last lesson." She turned to the pages slowly, her heart catching on every line. "I used to think teaching ended in classrooms. I was wrong. The world is the only classroom that matters, and every kind soul we meet is a chance to keep learning. Another line, kindness isn't inherited. It's demonstrated. It's the quietest kind of revolution." She kept reading until she reached the last page where the ink was darker, as if he'd pressed the pen harder to leave the words behind. Kindness was the last subject I ever learned. Taryn closed the notebook and held it to her chest. The clock on the wall ticked softly, echoing the same rhythm as the watch in her pocket. She sat back down by the window, letting the glow of the streetlights wash over her face. For the first time since his death, she smiled, not a sad smile, but the kind that comes when grief finally turns into gratitude. The next morning she woke before sunrise. The first rays of light filtered through the curtains, bathing the living room in gold. She made a pot of coffee, poured 2 cups, and set one across from her on the small table by the window, just like she used to at the diner. "Good morning, Mr. Gaines," she said quietly, her voice breaking but sure. She imagined him there, hat on the chair, pocket watch, ticking, that faint smile on his face as he looked out at the world he'd quietly made better. She sat there a long time, sipping her coffee slowly, listening to the heartbeat of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the breeze through the old oak outside, and the subtle ticking that filled the silence with life. By mid-morning, she knew what she had to do. She put on her coat, tucked the watch into her pocket, and locked the door behind her. When she reached Miller's diner, the morning rush had begun. Manny looked up from the counter, surprise written across his face. "You're late, kid," he said. "Had to take care of something," she replied, slipping on her apron. She moved through the diner with calm precision, refilling cups, greeting regulars, and cleaning tables. When she reached the corner booth, the one by the window, she paused. For a moment, she just stood there, the memory of him filling the space like sunlight. Then she took out the silver coin, polished it with her thumb, and placed it gently in the center of the table. The regulars noticed, but said nothing. There was something sacred in the gesture, something that didn't need explanation. Around noon, a young man came in nervous, tired, the kind of customer who looked like the world had forgotten him. He sat near the door, head bowed, waiting longer than he should have before anyone noticed. Taryn saw him and smiled. "Coffee?" she asked, already pouring. "Black's fine," he muttered, eyes on the table. She placed the cup in front of him and added, "First one's on the house." He looked up, startled. "Why, because mornings are gifts," she said simply. He stared at her for a moment, then nodded, a faint smile forming as he lifted the cup to his lips. She turned away before he could thank her, but her heart swelled. As she worked through the day, she felt something new, something alive, moving quietly beneath the surface. It was Mr. Gaines's presence, not haunting her, but guiding her, reminding her that kindness didn't end with a goodbye. It multiplied. That evening, after closing, she walked back to the house on Willow Street. The sky was streaked with orange and violet, and the streetlights flickered one by one. When she stepped inside, the house greeted her like an old friend. She set her keys down, took the pocket watch from her coat, and placed it on the mantel beneath their framed photo. The steady ticking filled the room again, anchoring her in the present. She whispered, "You can rest now." Then she sat in his armchair and opened her notebook, the one she used for bills and shift schedules, and turned to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "The Morning Ledger, continued." Below it, her first entry, Day 1. "He taught me that kindness outlives us. That's how healing continues." She closed the notebook and looked towards the window. The first stars had begun to appear above Clearwater, faint, but determined, like distant echoes of light refusing to fade. The end. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let me know what part of the plot hit you the hardest, and where you're watching from. Your comments help us share these moments with others. Thanks for being part of this journey.